Good morning and welcome to Conservation Biology. This lecture is on species and species richness. This first part of this lecture will be species concepts. So species are at the core of conservation biology, and what I mean by that is it's the most common measure of biodiversity. And species differ in their ecosystem services, and they differ in their evolutionary histories, and they are the future. Unless they go extinct, they could become future species. A species concept is how humans attempt to wrap their minds around this dynamic thing. So species have an evolutionary history and then they become new species. We're looking at a snapshot in time and trying to wrap our brains around this dynamic process. But we still have to do it. There are many species concepts. I saw a paper that described over 20 different species concepts. That's too many to cover in this course. We're going to cover the most common and most widely used species concepts out there. They're often contentious, so you'll see lots of blogs, lots of papers arguing that different species concepts work better than others. There's no perfect species concept, right? Because we're trying to apply a human definition to a dynamic biological entity. So we're always going to miss something. Our species concepts have real world impacts. So the Endangered Species Act focuses on species. So how we define species may determine if that particular population gets protection or not. Species concepts are important in biodiversity assessment. So how we quantify biodiversity is certainly dependent on species definitions. I divide up definitions into two approaches. One is an operational definition, and this applies to any object in the world. An operational definition allows us to put boundaries around something. So when we apply operational definitions to species, it allows us to give criteria by which we separate one species from another. There are ontological definitions, and that tells us what a species is, okay? And I say with a capital IS, what it actually is. It may not tell us how to tell one species from another, okay? That's the operational definition. So I'll begin with what I consider the most intuitive species concept out there, and it's sort of an umbrella for all the other species concepts. It wasn't called the typological species concept, but how we think about species. This goes way back to Aristotle and his concept of eidos. Eidos is the essence or the idea of something, and so it exists in our heads, and all the actual entities we see out there are imperfect manifestations of this idea. And one analogy I thought I came up with was, this is why field guides work. They show one picture of a plant or a butterfly or a robin, and that represents the entire species. So even though a robin may not exactly match, if it's close enough, it's the same thing, okay? So one interesting consequence of the typological species concept is that individual variation is not important. As long as it has these essential traits that unite that population, they're all considered the same species. It's how we do field guides, and it's how we place specimens in museums. The typological species concept is sort of the first working definition when we are examining biodiversity. So let's say you are going through the Amazon, you see this cool bird, you collect it, and you want to know, is is this new species? If that individual becomes a new species, that's the type specimen. And the holotype is the specimen that an author uses when they publish a new species. So if this was a type specimen of the crimson fruit crow, Guianan shield and endemic species, so it's only found in the Amazon in certain parts. If this was the holotype, then the author would have used that individual, no other individual, that individual, to describe the color, gut contents, measure the wings, the iris color, etc. And that individual now represents the species. Okay, so if you found another bird that you thought might be a new species but looks like this, you would take an individual compared to this species, and that's how you essentially start the process. We also have isotypes, which are other individuals of the holotype. So this is common in plants where you may collect a few, okay? Or think about marine sessile organisms like barnacles that gather together. You may collect a few, you pick out one to be the holotype and the other are the isotypes. And then if you don't have a holotype, you can have syntypes and lectotypes and neotypes, and all these things are used to represent a new species and can be the representative by which you compare a new specimen, okay? So the typological species concept is about 2,000 years old. And it wasn't until the 1940s when Ernst Mayr came along and really helped us pick out particular criteria by which we can set up boundaries between species. And Ernst Mayr used the criteria of interbreeding. So if you have a population of organisms that cannot breed with other organisms, then they're considered to be separate species. So one of the consequences of this is a lot of evolutionary biology looks at reproductive isolation. So what keeps one species from breeding with another? Okay, this is a very operational definition of species. It tells us how to determine if the crimson fruit crow might be different from another species of bird, but it doesn't tell you what a species is. So there's no ontological definition. Okay. So Ernst Mayr popularized this definition using interbreeding as the hallmark of how to determine species. That dominated from the 1940s to the 1990s, and even it's very much a popular species concept today. It's probably still in introductory biology textbooks. I know you still find it in evolutionary textbooks, but it's slowly being replaced by newer species concepts. The biological species concept is relatively conservative. And what I mean by that is it tends to lump species. So if you find out that two organisms from different populations can actually interbreed, you can make an argument that they're actually the same species. And this has had some consequence for conservation. So in the state of Pennsylvania, in fact on the East Coast, the golden winged warbler for a long time was considered a different species. It's represented in field guides as a different species that has a unique song. You can always see it and hear it, and it's very clearly something different from a close relative, the blue-winged warbler. However, these species interbreed, and so there's been an argument that golden-winged warblers and blue-winged warblers are actually one species. Okay, so we have two, now you have one. I think if you did that repeatedly over a number of closely related species, if you stuck to the biological species concept, you'd have fewer species overall. The phylogenetic species concept started to become popular in the 1990s among some evolutionary biologists. And this is an interesting definition. It takes a little bit of time to explain. So a species is the smallest coherent unit of a population that's topogenetic. So what that means is if you think about the way genes move in a population for sexually reproducing organisms, genes come together, they go back apart into their offspring, and then these offspring will reproduce with other organisms. And so genes form this webbing. Okay? And the smallest cohesive unit is a species. And you know they're a unique species because they have unique traits that they don't share with other populations. And we call these things autapomorphies. So, for example, robin has autapomorphies that make it different from other thrushes. Okay, so it has alleles, not necessarily genes, but it has alleles that you would only find in robins. And you might find that gene in other species, but not those alleles. It's more liberal than the biological species concept because you can take organisms that may potentially interbreed, but for some reason they're not. So, for example, the golden-winged warbler and the blue-winged warbler, if you find alleles within the golden-winged warbler that are not found within the blue-winged warbler, you could argue that those are different species. So this is a common way to define species, looking for unique alleles, and you end up with many more species. And in fact, you could have, and this happens with reptiles quite often, you could have a wide-ranging species once considered to be a single species and broken up into 4 or 5 different species because the populations are not interbreeding, even though if you put them together, they would. And I just want to point out that the biological species concept is rarely tested. And what I mean by that is, you know, if species are not reproductively isolated, they could reproduce. And honestly, I don't know of any experimental test of this outside of fruit flies to determine if species can interbreed or not. I don't know where people have taken toucans to test 2 different toucan species can interbreed, parrots. I think it happens within the pet trade, but outside of that, as an actual test of species concepts, I have not seen that. However, phylogenetic species concept is used quite often. So you'll often see people put out arguments that population should be broken up into different species based on alleles that are not shared between populations. And again, this is an operational definition. It tells you how to define species, but it doesn't really tell you what a species is. And about the same time the phylogenetic species concept was replacing biological species concept, the evolutionary species concept came on the scene. And that defines species as species that have their own evolutionary history and their own trajectory, meaning they've been isolated, and it looks like they're going to keep being isolated. And it doesn't matter if they've evolved new traits or not. It's just their evolution is different from other populations. Okay, so this is a purely ontological definition. And although this was originally proposed by George Gaylord Simpson in the 1930s and 40s during the synthesis, it was largely ignored until the 1990s when Ed Wiley came out with a number of papers. And I say this definition is purely ontological. He was asked during a talk I attended, you know, when did Labrador duck become a Labrador duck? And it was when a duck went to Labrador and started a population. So as soon as it started a population, it became its own species. And I will say this is the most liberal of popular species concepts, although it's rarely used as a something that's published to define new species. And when I say most liberal, because you don't need to recognize different alleles, that you can just assume that, say, species on the Galapagos are different species from those on the mainland, because there's no way for them to interbreed. And so, of course, they're different species. And so it lacks an operational aspect. So what I see today is a hybrid of evolutionary and phylogenetic species concept, where the evolutionary tacks on an ontological aspect to it, that these are uniquely evolving populations, and the phylogenetic species concept tags on an operational definition, and we know they're independently evolving because they have unique alleles. Then we have species concepts that we use because we don't understand the biology of these organisms. So the morphological species concept is one that you'll often see in conservation biology. It's strictly operational, it's used in the field, and it's very close to the typological species concept in that there's some core essential traits that define a species and other species. And we use this in two circumstances. One is when you're doing a field study and you have many, many species in your samples that are not described and the biology is not understood. So a species becomes a placeholder. Because if you want to quantify biodiversity, so you want to know the numbers of species without understanding if this is a new species or not, you simply call it species 1, species 2, species 3, etc. We also use the morphological species concept in paleontology because we don't know anything about the ability of dinosaurs to interbreed as far as I know, for example. I don't want to just say dinosaurs, things like trilobites. So what we do is we define a species by a number of traits. And if you find a fossil that has that traits, it's that species, right? So this is how we know Stegosaurus, Triceratops, T-Rex, right? So you know a T-Rex when you see it because it has those traits that the original T-Rex description has. And so all these things are based on phenotype. We don't know anything about gene flow in dinosaurs, right? At least extinct dinosaurs. We understand it in birds, of course. So I'll talk about subspecies, even though it's probably more contentious than species concepts. It's often used by curators in museums, and you'll see it published as well in biodiversity studies. So often the biology is not worked out, so in particular gene flow. And so you have organisms that are physically different, so the phenotype is different, and we just don't know if those are different species or not. And if more than likely these things are going to be different species, but it all depends. So sometimes a species can be organisms that occur along a smooth gradient. So on one end, you have, say, a species whose individuals are larger in the north and smaller as they get to the equator. And then there's a gradient of sizes in between. Often you'll see that the individuals in certain regions are called different subspecies, although there might be gene flow with local selection along that gradient. So in this case, subspecies are a marker of phenotypes and not necessarily gene flow. Where you have disjunct populations like these leopards. So leopards occur in the Eastern Hemisphere, in the Southern Eastern Hemisphere, including Africa and Asia. And if these populations are not interbreeding with other populations, then they probably are valid species. And of course, you could have a mixture of both things going on. You could have some populations that are isolated and becoming different, and you could have those that occur along a gradient where their sizes differ and their pelage differs along that range as well. Do species concepts matter? Absolutely. It's important for biodiversity studies, as I mentioned on the first slides. It's important for legislation. And I mentioned the Endangered Species Act. So there's quite a bit to unwrap in the Endangered Species Act and the definition of species. So it includes any subspecies, so they recognize subspecies, a fish or wildlife or plants, and any distinct population segment of any species. So they're recognizing population segments, what I think that means is populations that are separate from other populations. So they recognize a population segment as a species, which would be the evolutionary species concept. However, it says of any species of vertebrate, fish, or wildlife which interbreeds when mature. So they're going back to the biological species concept. And it says which interbreeds, not can interbreeds. So it is the biological species concept, but with the caveat that it actually interbreeds, not can interbreed. So it sounds like if I was to classify what species concept the Endangered Species Act adheres to, would be more of the phylogenetic species concept or the evolutionary species concept. Okay, which is a tip of the hat to the biological species concept. And these things matter. So the dusky seaside sparrow made the news a few decades ago because it was disappearing, and we brought a number of individuals in. I think it was 4 males and 1 male, and it was the seaside sparrow along the lower Florida coast, and I believe it was the nigrescens. And that subspecies went extinct. So the question is, did we lose a species or did we lose a subspecies? So in one case, it would just be an interesting population, and in one case, an entire species went extinct because of development on the Florida coast. And that's species concepts. If you have any questions, please send me an email, and I'll try to answer it when I can. Thanks.